And we are live. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Quest podcast. We've been doing these conversations every day this week, actually, with different voices. And today I'm really excited to be joined by someone who impacted my faith a great deal and I've gotten to hang out a bit with over the years, Shane Claiborne. Thank you so much for being here, Shane.
Yeah, buddy, it's great. I'm glad and honored to be a part of the conversation here. Thanks for having me.
Totally. So the first question I've been asking is, how in the world are you? How are you faring in the midst of this COVID-19, and how are you keeping yourself going in this time?
Well, we're doing all right, man. I'll have to say, we've got this community on the north side of Philadelphia. We've been forming for over 20 years, and it's real locally based. We sometimes call it a village because we all live on the same block. We've got community gardens and murals, and so we're pretty well equipped to take care of each other in the middle of this. We have actually ramped up almost everything that we're doing locally. So we're giving out hundreds of bags of food and blankets and toiletries and things, and it's neighbors here taking care of neighbors. So we've got like almost every day we're doing stuff here, and we're trying to be real smart about it. We've got new protocols and all the I've been saying we're trying to be both courageous and cautious, at the same time. But there's a lot of folks that are really vulnerable, like folks that are on the streets. What the heck does quarantine mean if you don't have a home, and and folks in, victims of domestic violence, where home's not a safe place to get locked in, and folks that are in prison. So we're trying to really keep our eyes out for brothers and sisters that are really vulnerable right now. But in a lot of ways, Katie and I are well equipped for this. Like I travel so much that we're just taking this as a wonderful time to hunker down and do some things. We're reading books, and we've got actually one of the best rhythms of life that we've had. I'm running and exercising, and we're reading our scripture in the morning. I mean, crazy stuff. I've got. I think this, Brandon, but other people may not. We've been learning blacksmithing so that we can turn guns into garden tools. So I literally have a pile, an arsenal of guns in my basement that are all decommissioned, but we're catching up on all those. And we were blacksmithing yesterday. I just made my first heart necklaces out of the crushed barrel of guns. So we're making garden tools. So I'm getting repurposing some metal. But yeah, it's been awesome, man. I mean, aside from the suffering of others, I think we're trying to do our best to make the most of this season. And I heard a friend yesterday say, let's be positive, productive, and stay physical, so we're trying to do all those things and, really,
Yeah.
And we can mobilize. I mean, we're in the middle of a stinking election year that's like, a crossroads in American history. So we're doing our best to shine in the darkness and mobilize virtually for this season too.
Yeah, totally. And so you've been a part of, I don't even know if people still use this language, but earlier, 10 years ago or so, maybe, I don't know, you talked about new monasticism a lot. And this really does feel, I've talked in the past 3 days to 2 ex-monks, one person living kind of as a monk, and now new monasticism here. This is a time, in a sense, where we really are all getting an opportunity to have this period that none of us could have ever dreamed, where we would have months at a time to disconnect in some ways and reconnect in new ways. I wonder, I think those 3 Ps are really helpful. Are there any practices and tools, I know you have some tools, that people might be able to use in this season as they are finding themselves with time and also a sense of kind of despair and anxiety, how they can channel that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, the monasticism language, it wasn't our original language. In fact, I didn't grow up Catholic or anything. I didn't know a whole lot about the monastic, history in the church. But as we started forming communities, and practicing some of the really ancient spiritual practices of the church, some classic monastic folks kind of projected that onto us. You know, they're like, yeah, we've been doing this for like 1600 years, you know, and we don't have it all figured out, but we could be a sounding board for you. So we've taken a lot of cues from those traditions. For instance, one of my mentors here in Philly is like a 90-year-old nun. And she came out of this tradition of desert spirituality. So she like literally lived in a desert for years. And then she kind of draws on that tradition, but she said, I began to realize that we've kind of misunderstood this tradition. We think that these desert monks were kind of just fleeing society and going to the desert, but they were actually building a new society in the desert. They were building kind of a new world in the shell of the old one. And they had, went to the desert because it's where people who didn't have anything could, be on sort of the margins of society. So she said this, she said, I just realized that the inner city is the contemporary desert. And this is where we can find God, where we can build a new society. So she started a community with folks that were, many of them homeless, many of them formerly incarcerated, folks that are recovering from substance addictions. And it's one of the brightest lights in Philly. It's called New Jerusalem. And so there's like 60 folks there that are all, I mean, they're doing the 12 steps in recovery and stuff, but they're also mirroring the monastic traditions and the hours of prayer and things like that. So it's, it's something that as we built our community and in the larger network of communities, we found it really helpful to see that these are folks that they fell deeply in love with Jesus, and it redefined how they lived in the world. So one of the things that monastic folks do through history is they hold together prayer and practice. And we've kind of divided those. We got a lot of activists that don't pray much and a lot of prayer warriors that, kind of hide behind their prayers and don't do much, and we want to do both of those. And I think for some of those traditional vows have been things like living simply, a commitment to nonviolence, chastity when it comes to sexuality, that's kind of seeing God as our love. And, it meant abandoning a lot of things in the pursuit of, as Jesus said, the pearl that was worth leaving everything for. And so, some of those things are a part of our DNA. And we created this prayer book called Common Prayer that we built with like dozens of other people, some of them Catholic, Protestant, Anabaptist, Charismatic, all together as we created that. And that's one thing I would invite people to use. And I can say that because it's something I use, and we created it out of our own kind of longing to be, to hold together prayer and action. So it's for free on an app on Android and on iOS. And it's also online, commonprayer.net, and we've got it in book form too. So that's a really good resource for me. And every month we remember some of what we call the 12 marks of new monasticism, but really they're just kind of 12 practices or values of our Christian discipleship. And they include things like living simply and a commitment to nonviolence and racial justice and caring for the environment. So we, every month we remember one of those. And so that's one thing, I might point people to. But this kind of quarantine space, it puts us in a space that's been really important for the church. I mean, I don't want to, separate this from the tremendous suffering and fear that many have, and folks that this is not a great time for them, but I think for those of us that can try to make something out of a tough situation, remembering that the 40 years in the wilderness, Jesus's 40 days in the desert. I mean, these times of like kind of a quarantine have created a spiritual place where you move out of that space and are restored to community with a new vitality and a new vision. So I think that's the possibility of what this could be. And, for some of us, we try to do that annually with the season of Lent. But there's a lot of folks that are giving up things they didn't think they'd be giving up,
Yeah.
Wait, what? The wine and spirits is not a essential service, or whatever. But I think it's something we can really embrace, I think, in some ways.
Totally. Yeah, for me, this season has been a revelation of just how undisciplined my life normally is, because you have all this. And I hate actually saying you have all this extra time, because for so many of us, we actually find ourselves doing more work or if you're an Enneagram 3 like me, I feel guilty if I just am sitting around not doing anything. And yet I can't get myself to do what you were talking about doing. I can't get up and do my exercises. I'm like, I need to figure out how to better establish a rhythm in life. And I am starting to pick up resources like Common Prayer and other resources. So thanks for making that and putting that out into the world. One of the big ideas before COVID-19, when I wanted to start this new iteration of my podcasting history, it was really this fascination with the question why people have continued on the spiritual path that they've continued on, especially people that I know and have watched evolve in their faith and its expression. And I think you're a great example of that, because for those who might not know, you got your start kind of way back at Willow Creek Community Church back in the day, an evangelical congregation. And that took you to be out with Mother Teresa. And now you've kind of, your faith with the Red Letter Christians has evolved, it seems, at least from a distance, into a slightly different form. And so I wonder, the big question is, what has kept you so fascinated with Jesus all of this time? And what does your relationship with God look like, to use evangelical language? What does that look like today?
I appreciate that question. This is a great conversation, man. Sometimes you rehash the same questions, but this is really lovely. I guess I think I've always liked that line. I can't remember who said it, but they said, I think of my faith more as a romance than of a theory, than as a theory, less of a theory, more of a romance. And I think what happened to me is I definitely saw different ways I was kind of coerced or even manipulated into Christianity growing up, and the things that compel people to join the church aren't always the best things. I think I went to services that it was the prosperity gospel. Like, if you want to, prosper financially, if you want health and wealth, and name it and claim it and come to Jesus and God will bless you, And then there's another version that I think is just as toxic, which is scaring the hell out of people, and we did these things literally called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, where, God's going to come back and there's going to be a rapture. And, if you don't know Jesus, you're going to burn in hell for all eternity. And so, at the end of the day, there just kind of came a point where I was like, man, I didn't choose Jesus because I wanted mansions in heaven and streets of gold, or because I was scared to death of hell. I chose Jesus because I fell in love. And who I think of Jesus is the incarnation, the embodiment, the manifestation of God's love in all of its perfection, in a way that we can actually touch and wrap our hands around and follow. I've learned some of that from my Catholic friends. Some of them are nuns and monks. Like Mother Teresa called Jesus her spouse, which I've always found it funny when my evangelical friends go, well, Catholics don't believe in a personal relationship with Jesus. I'm like, man, it doesn't get much more personal than that, so I think of prayer as in a sense, just when I was with Mother Teresa and the sisters, they called it adoration. We would adore Jesus. We would just lay silent at the foot of the cross. I mean, that's literally part of the prayer life that I learned in India. And so there's a part of our faith that's just leaning into God's love and thinking about Jesus, and then praying that Jesus would live in us and through us. As Paul said, the life I live, I no longer live, but Jesus lives in me. And I think communion or the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, all of those are ways that we kind of try to get at the mystery of that. But, I heard my Catholic friends say, we are what we eat, and that's what we're thinking about at communion. But we're internalizing Christ, and that we literally are the body of Christ to the world. So now, just as God lived in Jesus, God lives in us. So to me, that's all a part of the beautiful kind of mystery. And it's what keeps me in my faith. Is I believe we're here for a reason, and that's to make God's love known to the world. And we do that not just with bumper stickers and t-shirts, but by the way that we love each other and the way that we love the most vulnerable.
Totally. And what's been so interesting, and I'm sure you've seen this, because we've both kind of been part of this interesting stream of people that have come from that kind of coercive Christianity. And this really does seem to be, not to use old and tired language, but like it is a new movement that is birthing, that there are lots of people that are saying, hey, I've been actually studying the Apostle Paul's language, where he talks about meat versus milk. He talks about mature spirituality versus kind of elementary spirituality. And not to say that with a sense of self-righteousness or anything, but to say we come from a spirituality that taught us a lot of good basics, black and white answers to things. But as we have evolved, for me at least, and it seems for you, following Jesus has actually become more and more about actually following Jesus. Like, I remember growing up just a few years ago, actually, when I was kind of in the Reformed tradition, I used to hear literally pastors, famous ones from the pulpit, say, the Sermon on the Mount is meant to show us just how unable we are to actually follow what Jesus does. And at the time, that felt really great, because it did feel like a permission slip to say, I can't actually love my neighbor as myself. So let's just be real. And I was looking through some of your old videos yesterday, and you have this one video, The Greatest Sermon Ever Preached, where you eat some fire at the beginning of it, which I didn't know you did. Fascinating. And then you just read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And it struck me about just how profound that was, because what you're communicating subtly and really loudly there is that this is actually what it means to follow Jesus. This is possible. This is what we should be aiming at. And I wonder why do you think people are waking up and saying we actually can and need to embrace the way of Jesus, whether or not that means believing all these theological claims? And you've already touched on it a bit, but what role does the belief play in actually living into kind of the justice of Jesus?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that as I look at Christian history, I see that we so often separate things that were never meant to be separated. And one of those is orthodoxy and orthopraxis, right? Orthodoxy, where we get our idea of right belief, which is where we get the word doctrine, right? Right believing is a part of Christianity, but so is orthopraxis, right practices. And that's where we've kind of gotten lost, is we've reduced Christianity to a doctrinal statement. And even our language in the church is about making believers. Are you a believer? And yet you look at Jesus, and it's pretty clear that he didn't just come to make believers. He came to form disciples. And in Corinthians, it even says you can have faith to move mountains, and do all sorts of miracles and prophecies and fathom all the depths of wisdom. But if you don't have love, it's still empty. And when we just focus on the beliefs, we often lose the essence of our faith. It's kind of like thinking you've baked a cake when all you have is the raw ingredients, and there's no, like, you haven't even made anything yet. And so I think, like, um, both of those are so important, and there's some sloppy theology out there. So I think we need to do good theology to counter bad theology. It's why I've written, my last couple of books on the death penalty and gun violence, because I think our theology can be very violent and lend us to violent things if we're not careful. So, like, if we have lost this idea of the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus, I think we've gotten our orthodoxy wrong. And there's people that say that that's not really important. Resurrection's mystical. It just, So I think, on the other hand, our greatest challenge is not just right thinking, but it's right living. It's how does this translate? And that's where you really see, I think, the giant hole in our Christianity in America. Because you have Christians that would, if you gave them a doctrinal test, they're going to pass it. But when you say, what does that look like? How does that manifest itself? And Jesus is really clear in his final judgment in Matthew 25, as like, we're going to be asked, not like, did you believe in the virgin birth? But we're going to be asked, did you visit me when I was in prison? Did you welcome me when I was a stranger, an immigrant? Did you provide health care for me when I was sick? Did you give me food when I was hungry. So if our faith doesn't demonstrate itself in real concrete acts of love and compassion, then maybe we're just believers, but we're not followers or disciples of Jesus. So that's kind of how I think. And so often when people tell me that they've given up on Christianity, I kind of probe a little bit more and say, tell me about what you've given up on. And as they describe it, it's a version of Christianity that I can hardly even recognize because it doesn't
Yeah.
look much like Jesus. And there's a lot of things that um, they get branded Christian, but it's really just a version of American nationalism that's camouflaging itself as Christianity. But the real test of something being Christian is, does it reflect Jesus? That's what Christian means.
Mm.
Christ-like. Is it Christ-like? Is it loving? And so when we've become known for so many of the things that Jesus spoke out against, like self-righteousness, like excluding people, judging people, like condemning people, like we've got a version of Christianity that I think in many ways is quite toxic. But the better, like the best solution to what's wrong is the practice of something better. So that's where I think with Red Letter Christians, and you've been such a big instrumental part of that, is like the name came about from actually a secular Jewish DJ that was interviewing Jim Wallace and said, I've read a lot of the Bible and there's parts of it that I love. There's parts of it that I kind of find confusing, but I've always liked the stuff in red, and he was talking about the gospels that are often highlighted in red. And he said, you should call yourselves Red Letter Christians. And I think we noticed, as Gandhi said, that, we love Jesus. We just wish the Christians acted more like him. And
Yeah.
we want to be folks that are trying to live those things. So like when I read the Sermon on the Mount, sometimes I think we just need to go back to Matthew 5-7 and say, what if Jesus really meant the stuff he said?
Yeah.
And a lot of our terrible like politics right now, the support and defense of Donald Trump is happening because we've kind of divorced these things. So literally, Jerry Falwell Jr. was asked about how does he reconcile his love for Jesus and his fidelity to Trump? And he said point blank, I do not look to Jesus when it comes to shaping my political beliefs.
Yeah.
I mean, that should stop any Christian in their tracks, but like what he goes on to say is, Jesus didn't come to tell Caesar how to run Rome. He came to show individuals how to live, but really it's irrelevant what Jesus had to say, when it comes to society. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy, so yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm glad you brought that up because I've been in this pastor thing for 3 years and I found myself surprisingly getting very political very quickly. And a lot of people get really nervous when they hear pastors or church leaders or Christian leaders talking about politics. And I think what's important, and you've touched on this, it's not about partisanship. It's not about one side or the other. That's exactly the kind of immature faith that we're trying to move away from. It's not the black and white dualism, but it is to say, it seems like we fundamentally misunderstood what politics is. It's just literally the affairs of the people. And if that's not what Jesus is about, then goodness gracious, what is it? But how do you respond to the people who might look at Red Letter Christians, for instance, and say, you all are getting way too political. You all are becoming a tool of the Democratic Party or whatever. What is your response to that?
Well, thanks, Brandon. This is something that's really important to me. And in fact, several years ago, it was so important that we started doing Bible studies and things to try to figure out, what is a faithful Christian posture in election year. And this was, a couple of national elections ago. And we wrote a book out of that called Jesus for President. And I mean, I come out of a history with a great political suspicion. The Catholic workers and there's a certain vein of Christianity that has sort of an anarchistic spirit, and I've really it's in my blood a little bit. So and yet what I've come to see is exactly what you've said, is that a part of loving my neighbor as myself means caring about policies that affect their lives. And I can't say I love my neighbor and ignore the policies that really, really allow them to either flourish or they squash their dignity and hope. So, immigration reform is a part of what it means to welcome the stranger. I mean, but what you said that's so important is to be nonpartisan doesn't mean that we are non-political. And it is very important to stay nonpartisan. Is our friend Tony Campolo said, mixing our faith with a political party is like mixing manure and ice cream. It doesn't mess up the manure, but it really messes up the ice cream. And I think the religious right can show us full on display what it looks like for faith to be totally meshed with a political party. Um, but the answer to that, I think, is to align ourselves with the values that we see at the heart of Jesus, and that it's that which begins to shape and influence how we think about welcoming immigrants or gun reform or whatever, And for me, a helpful framework for that is the consistent life ethic that parts of the church have really embraced, that says every person is made in the image of God. And anytime someone's dignity or life is squashed, like we lose a part of God's image in the world. And I think the pro-life language has often just been so narrowly focused on abortion that we would be more accurate to call it anti-abortion or pro-birth, but not pro-life, because it's so inconsistent that you can say I'm pro-life, but you can be pro-guns, pro-military, pro-death penalty, and anti-life on everything but abortion. So that's where I want, a more robust ethic of life. And that's a great framework for me when I'm thinking about the death penalty or gun violence or environmentalism or advocating and supporting LGBTQ rights. So when it comes to like Black Lives Matter, like all of these have everything to do with life. And one more thing on that is that, in the civil rights movement, people constantly told Martin Luther King and others that, this is too political. Don't talk about that from the pulpit. And the interesting thing is that, I, as we look at history, we can see that racism was a political issue, but it was also a spiritual issue. And I'm convinced that so many of these things that we're talking about, it's not hard for many Christians to see abortion as both a ethical and spiritual issue and a political issue. But why don't we keep that same thinking when we talk about gun violence, for instance? Like people say, oh, it's not a gun problem, it's a heart problem or a sin problem. And what we've been saying is it's both, right? No law is going to change a violent heart or a racist heart. No law is going to change that. We need God to do that. But we also need to change some policies. God changes hearts and we change laws. And the civil rights movement would have been, missing a part of it if we just said we just need God to heal racist hearts. But we also needed to change laws so people could swim in the same swimming pools and, drink from the same water fountains and vote, So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And I really appreciate that because I think, again, there are lots of lay Christians that are struggling with this because there has been a response, even among evangelicals in the past, to say, we are not the religious right. We don't want to be like that. And so there is obviously a welcome skepticism to being political, and yet understanding that, like you said, our policies for our neighbor really do matter. And you've been so on this forefront of pushing, I don't know if we'll say evangelicals, to be more Jesus-y, justice-oriented over the past 10, 20, 30 years. And one of the areas that's been obviously the hottest issue over the last decade that we've talked about personally before is LGBT inclusion. And you and I have had that conversation. I've been included in Red Letter Christians, and the platform has been pretty pro-LGBT rights over the past 5-6 years. And so I just wanted to talk because there has been some questions just about where you stand and if how you view this from a lens of Red Letter Christianity. And so I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, surely, man. And I I hope that I mean, I think that you know, but other folks may not know. It's not just that you are included, that you are actually shaping and forming like Red Letter Christians. It's not mine. I think we're trying to be sensitive to what the Spirit's doing. But from the beginning of Red Letter Christians, we've had a statement of inclusion and affirmation that you helped shape all of our events. We've been really, really clear on that. I think we've got to start with some things that every Christian should be able to say passionately, unapologetically, and then, dig a little deeper on those. But those are things like when several years ago, the Barna Research Group, you saw this study, maybe many others did. They went to every state in the US and they asked young non-Christians, what do you think of when you hear the word Christian? And the number one answer was anti-gay. Number two was judgmental, and number three was hypocritical. I mean, the list was terrible, right? But the fact that the number one thing that people thought of when they hear the word Christian, and these are young non-Christians that were polled, is anti-gay, surely should cause everyone to stop and say, we've done something terribly wrong here. We have not navigated this well, right? And so what did not register on the Barna poll was the number one thing that Jesus said that they will know you are Christians by, which is love. And that's what I want people to say. And that's, part of what I've been saying, for 20 years that I've been speaking and writing, is that we need to be known for love. We need to be able to say every person is made in the image of God, and that includes Black trans folk. It includes everyone: gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, BG. The whole spectrum of folks that are made in the image of God. We're made from the same dirt of this earth that God breathed life into. Now, I think we also have to say that we are advocates for people's rights, for LGBTQ plus rights, and that when anyone's discriminated against, that we should feel that as if we ourselves were suffering. I think that for some of us, this needs to be personal, because when we just talk about people as if they're an issue, there's something that feels empty in that, right? And I mean, I'm not just talking about LGBTQ, plus conversation, but gun violence, like even the death penalty, all these, like there are people made in the image of God that are, their lives are at stake in all of this. And that became real to me when I was in college. And I mean, there's been several really pivotal moments, but one was a young man that, actually a really good friend of mine, that we lived on the same floor together. And he told me, he grew up in the church and had gone to retreats to try to pray away the gay. He had done all that, had folks try to cast demons out of him because he was gay. And so at the end of the day, he said, I just feel like God made a mistake. And he's just started crying, And I've heard lots of iterations of that story over the past 20 years, different versions of that narrative. And you come to a point of going like, if he can't find a home in the church, then who have we become, right? Now I am I think one of the crossroads on this becomes like around the sacrament of marriage. And this is where I've been thinking and doing a lot of listening, mostly Brandon, on this and I am not optimistic that we are all going to agree on the sacrament of marriage. I mean, I think you just talked with James Martin, there's other, I think that there are understandings of what marriage is that we are not going to all agree. And the United Methodist Church just, had I think an epic fail on being able to hold attention on this, and they excluded the affirming congregations and folks. And but there are other circles that we're in that I think are on the progressive side of this, and they're drawing a line in the sand. And if you don't agree on this issue, then you can't speak to anything else, you know? So literally you couldn't have Pope Francis speak at some of the progressive gatherings that we're at, you know? So I think that it's the line in the sand that I'm kind of resistant to, as far as like saying you're out if you don't agree on this, because I think we can affirm with love and dignity every person, advocate for people's civil rights, and still disagree on the sacrament of marriage and hold some tension there. And this is where I would say, like, even pastors within the same denomination may need to be able to disagree on this. I just talked to a church where within the same congregation, there are pastors that would navigate this differently. So one pastor in that congregation might marry same gendered couples, and the other pastor may not, you know? So I think that this is much more difficult, and that doesn't come really too personally to me because I'm not ordained and I'm not faced with a decision. But I would even see it in every instance. I think the sacrament of marriage is a pastoral decision, and there's a lot of discernment that needs to go into it, whether it's heterosexual or not. You know, I think that it's very difficult for me just to blanket say I endorse all marriages, because I think there is such a pastoral element to that, and there's, you know, folks that I think have been divorced and are getting remarried that I think is pretty actually a very clear difference from Jesus's teaching. But my mom has, you know, been remarried, and so I'm, you know, like I think that's a pastoral decision. So I think this is one of those things that we've got to find some common ground on, as we've had in RLC, but also realize that there's going to be some spaces, especially around the sacrament of marriage, that we're probably not going to land in the same place. But 10 years ago, we got a bunch of communities together, and we were able to make a statement together that, as we talked about this, where we said, we can agree on this. We support celibate singles and monogamous married couples and their children. And some folks will go, well, what do you mean by marriage? And we go, exactly. There are some communities that discern that differently, you know?
Yeah.
That's what we could agree on. And the last thing I'll say on this, bro, is that I think sometimes we end up talking a lot about sex and not as much about love. And the deepest longing inside of us is to love and be loved. And I know plenty of people that have a lot of sex and they don't experience love in a very real way. And there's still kind of a long loneliness. And I know other folks, especially my Catholic friends, that are committed to living a life of celibacy without sex, but they experience love and community really deeply. And so I think we got to do a much better job at creating communities where folks, regardless of their sexuality, are able to find a home.
Totally. I appreciate that. And I do agree. And part of my own personal ministry over the past 5 years, since I came out as an openly gay person, has been to look back to my evangelical friends, the people, the pastors, and say, this can't be a measure of orthodoxy. On the one thing I ran from in evangelicalism was the fact that they use the language of this is a gospel issue when it comes to sexuality, that if you disagree on this, you are not saved, you're going to hell. Now, I don't believe in that theology anymore, but I do think there needs to be, we can agree on kind of what you said, the dignity of every single person. I also think a no-brainer is that everyone should be included fully into the life of the church. I can't ever imagine Jesus looking at anyone saying, I want to come and follow, and him saying, no, you can't because of whatever. And you're right. I think it's not the answer I want for the future of the church. And yet you look at the Roman Catholic Church, you look at some of our bigger Protestant denominations, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be any major movement of those large ancient institutions in the near future. And so the question is, as you've raised, how do we, I do think, work towards progress? I have an agenda. I would like to see the whole church be inclusive of LGBT marriages, but also stay in dialogue around if you can affirm my dignity, if you can welcome me as a person, if you can agree not to preach that you believe God made a mistake or will condemn me to hell because of expressing this this orientation, then I think we have a call and a command from Jesus to try to be together. Obviously, unity was one of his biggest pleas. So I appreciate you taking some time to talk about that.
Yeah, totally, man. And I think the conversation also has a deeper complexity as you move outside of the US and even the English speaking world, because even our LGBTQIA, you know, it's kind of like this is all kind of an English centered conversation in some ways, that as you extend outside of that, it really shifts and changes. So I think we need a lot of grace, and even as the conversation deepens here in the US, I find that people have very different definitions of what they mean by affirmation. Like, are you fully affirming? And I was just in a conversation a few weeks ago with someone that I said, tell me what you mean by that. Because I find people mean different things. Some people mean lifelong, monogamous, same sex, equitable partnerships are affirmed. And he said, no, we have people that are polyamorous in our congregation. And the way we define it is any consensual sexual relationship. And I said, so if someone else's wife consents to have, you know, a sexual relationship with another person's wife or husband, then it's consensual, and that's what you mean by affirming. He said, absolutely. I mean, we fully embrace polyamorous relationships. And I don't think this is like a slippery slope. All I'm saying is that I think that there are very different definitions as we really, you know, try to land some common language. Even for inclusion and affirmation, it becomes tricky. So yeah,
Totally.
I mean, the overarching, you know, umbrella is love and grace. And but then I do think that like, my understanding of sexuality is you can get really, really hurt by this.
Mhm.
You know, you can hurt other people and you can hurt yourself, not just sexuality. I mean, it's why I think we have any kind of boundaries um,
Yeah,
on life is so that but not just because God hates sin and doesn't want us to break the law, but God loves us and wants us not to hurt ourselves and other people. So I think, you know, fidelity and covenant, like these are very important, you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
themes in our faith.
Totally. And I do agree. I think that looking at other cultures and context in regards to these conversations are important because what we might consider as acceptable or normative, to use that language in the US, is not acceptable or normative in other cultures where, I mean, this is a whole nother ballgame, but polygamy in other cultures and having this Western colonizing idea of should we come in and say that all of that is wrong? There are lots of complexities to the sexuality conversation. And I think the thing that I appreciate about the Red Letter Christian movement is this commitment to saying, like, you and I probably stand a little bit different on how we would articulate our positions on sexuality. And we continue to engage and we continue to work together. And Red Letter Christians continues to uplift and elevate voices like mine and other folks that might have different positions. So I am appreciative of that. And to kind of steer it in a completely different direction, the one big question I also wanted to ask before we start taking questions from folks is, this is a season where I've experienced pastorally, a lot of people are having kind of that dark night of the soul. They're having, where is God? My faith feels like it's withering on the vine because I can't explain what's happening. One, have you walked through a dark night of the soul? And what would you speak to those people who are really wondering, like, how can I hang on to faith and hope when the world around us is literally on fire?
Yeah. Well, I should probably confess that whatever my Enneagram and whatnot, like I'm a 1 on the Enneagram, but on the other thing, I'm generally I see a lot of light. And so you know, I get told that I see the world through, you know, the rose colored glasses or whatever, but I think that what one of the things that is so profound about Jesus is that Jesus is born into the pain. I mean, he comes as a brown-skinned Palestinian Jewish refugee in the middle of a genocide. I mean, it is the most profound act of divine solidarity with the suffering of humanity from his birth to the cross. And on Thursday, tomorrow night, I'm going to be hosting a conversation, which folks are very welcome to join, just like this at 7 o'clock East Coast time, about the most famous execution in history, right on the eve as we remember Jesus's death on Good Friday. What does that mean? And one of the things that we can see that blows my mind is that Jesus had this long loneliness, as Dorothy Day said, this moment where Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? So literally, God feels the absence of God. I mean, that'll make your head spin for a little while, but I think that that's part of what we see in this is that Jesus suffers with those who suffer. As I've seen, a mother of someone being executed say, um, God knows what it feels like to watch your own son get executed. God knows what it means to be me. And so I think that is what we can really take some courage from. And of course, as we remember, as Tony says, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. The end of the story is that we know that what Jesus also confronts are all of the powers and the machinery of imperial torture and execution and hatred and violence. Um, and he triumphs over it with love and grace and an empty tomb. And so there is this real center part of our faith that I mean, you can't get to Easter without Good Friday. And so there's a whole part of this that realizes that God is with us in the darkness. I think that's really something that a lot of people like Mother Teresa, who had we now know had years of feeling doubt and despair in the middle of now she's a consecrated saint. So I think there's a lot of folks in history that have been close to God that haven't always felt close to God. But part of how we keep ourselves sensitive, I think, is by leaning into the suffering of the world as Jesus did and trying to do something meaningful to alleviate the pain of other people. That gives us, I think, a way to live and to live with some sense of meaning in the middle of a world where there is so much suffering. Is not to isolate and move ourselves away from it, but actually to do something that can lift the suffering of someone else.
Totally. I love that answer. And one question, this is interesting. If you put out a second edition of Irresistible Revolution, what would you add or adapt? Somebody asked.
Oh, that's fun. Well, this is an easy one because the answer is that we did exactly that just a few years ago. And I can say this because it was not my idea. Someone at the publisher said, okay, it's been 10 years. And, there's been, I don't know, 300,000 copies sold, but it's been 10 years. So why don't you go back and write some notes in the margins? So that's exactly what I did just a couple of years ago. I went through and I might write a few more now, but, as I went back, I finished some of the stories. I said, I might say this a little differently now, than I did 10 years ago. But so there is a new edition. I'm not just trying to sell books, but I'm saying I kind of did that, and there are things that were different. I mean, I was single when I wrote that book. I've, been married for almost a decade now. And, there's things like that I think are even more stark, that when I was talking about racial justice and things like that, these were kind of controversial issues. And now, I think, these are no-brainers now, but yeah, so.
Totally. Yeah. And I've asked this question in all my interviews, and I know it's hard as an author to answer this particular question, but I want to ask it. One, if you could tell everyone listening one book of yours to read kind of as an introduction, what would that be? And two, is there one or two books over your spiritual journey that has been the most impactful? And what would those be?
Awesome. Well, so, I mean, my first book And especially since there's an updated edition of it, like I would say that's a good intro to some of the stuff I'm thinking, because I do talk about, my journey into nonviolence and into, like thinking more simply about how we live and, all that stuff. So, um, the Irresistible Revolution was my first book. But then some of the politics stuff, I think that especially during this election season, some folks might find a real breath of fresh air from Jesus for president, because that is part of the idea, is that our hope isn't in the donkey of the Democrats or the elephant of the GOP, it's in Jesus. And that's exactly what the early church meant when they said Jesus is Lord. They were saying Caesar is not. And there was a deeper political identity, than just the kind of partisan stuff that we have now. So, as far as other books, I'm looking at my shelf over here. Um, I mean, I have a book of sermons by Dr. King, Martin Luther King, that, it's a big old thick one. I think it's called The Trumpet of Conscience or something, a compilation of his sermons. It's just pure gold. Um, and I love in kind of a different vein, the selected writings of Dorothy Day.
Hmm.
Just beautiful, like real feet on the ground kind of stuff. And I think Dr. King and Dorothy Day are both sort of people that have shaped me. And then there's a bunch of others over there on my shelf, but I'll just name two since you said two.
Awesome. Well, seriously, thank you for that. And I do want to thank you for taking time in the midst of this crazy season to be with us all. Everybody watching, I want to say thank you to you all. And Shane, seriously, thanks for the work that you're doing in the world. Thanks for Red Letter Christians and the way you've helped expand that to be as inclusive and radical and on the edge as it is. And so I'm just grateful for you and to be a part of this group together.
You too, man. And from being a part of Red Letter, one of the things that we say is we want to harmonize but not homogenize.
Yeah.
We want to sing a song of Jesus and justice together. And actually, just like any symphony, it's more beautiful with as much diversity as we can possibly get. So I'm grateful for all that you bring, and we're all learning from each other. So thanks so much, buddy.
Yeah, thank you. And again, everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week with some more conversations. So have a good day, everybody.